Hello, hello. Welcome. Storytime with Moog. I am Moog. Today we're going to be reading Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon. Reading updates. I started this whenever it was that I started it, I think on Friday, and it's fine. I continued reading a bit more because I just want to get through it so that I can read other things because of course I have a million books to read. But I'm almost halfway and it's fine. I think I'm supposed to care more than what I do. It's about this woman. Her name is Elizabeth Zott, and this is in the 1950s, I want to say. And she is a chemist, and of course, being a woman in a science field in the 1950s has a lot of social and gender things thrown. And so she's trying to just make her way. She also does not want to have kids, and she also does not want to get married. So she gets into this relationship with another scientist, and she still holds true that she doesn't want to get married, she doesn't want to have kids, and he respects that. Um, and things drastically change because in the future, which is our first chapter, is 10 years later, and she is a single mom of a 6-year old or 10-year old. I don't know how old she is. I'm assuming 10-year old. But I just assume that everybody who is younger than me is 12 or 10, so um so yeah, and it's just her journey, I'm guessing, to get to where she is, because also in the future she is a not a celebrity chef, but she is a TV chef, and the way that she talks about cooking and the way that she talks about fueling yourself is very scientific. And she just has this hit show, and she doesn't say just add salt or add, whatever. She uses the chemical like name for everything and measures everything in millimeters and stuff like that, instead of saying a cup of this. She's use, however many millimeters of this and blah blah blah. So it's just interesting and educational at the same time. Um and yeah, I think I don't think that the book is boring. I can see why a lot of people really like this. I think I am just bored, and I think I it's just not the book for me, but I'm going to keep going at least a little bit more just to see. Just to see, because this was rated as the top debut author book of 2022. So we'll see. We'll see how it is. And it has to be rated top for a reason, right? Right? So we're gonna see. As a writer, you feel like it's fine is almost worse than it's terrible. Because at least there's feeling behind it, and it's not just apathy. Oh my gosh. And yeah, exactly. Because you have some emotion. And a lot of times, we've talked about this before, but a lot of times you're supposed to hate characters, or you're supposed to hate things that are happening, and a really good author can make you feel all of these things. So we'll see. Yeah, it can still be good, but just not my thing. And I think that's what's happening. We'll see. We'll see. It's not a DNF. We'll just see where it goes. Um, yeah, and I finished Akira, if anybody was keeping track. That was the sixth and final. So now I'm gonna rewatch the movie. I watched the movie before I read any of it, and it is just so compact and cut down that the movie was just it was a fever dream. It was just very confusing, and I didn't I just didn't know what was going on. And all I remembered from it was, I mean, a spoiler that I'm not gonna say, and then that they just ride motorcycles. That's all I remembered from it. I didn't know the plot at all. just because it was so compact. So like reading it, I think I'm gonna have like a better appreciation for the movie. So I'm gonna rewatch that eventually in my spare time because I feel like I'm behind on like everything, books, games, TV shows, movies. I'm behind on everything. I'm gonna go see Spider-Man today. Didn't I like forgot that it was out, but I'm gonna go see it and it'll be great. I have a feeling. I just really like Miles Morales. Okay. Anyway, that's not the point of today. Today, we're going to be reading Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, and this was a suggestion by Captain Hardship. So I'm really excited. It's been, I was going to say it's been a while since we've read science fiction, but I think the book right before Don Quixote was science fiction. Yeah, it totally was. So, yeah, we'll see how it goes. Did I look up to see what this was about? You know I didn't. You know I did not do that. Okay, but there is a preface, so we will read the preface. Also, this book is less than 200 pages. Apparently you can do that. Apparently the book doesn't have to be over 900 pages. Oh, Don Quixote. All right, so get settled in, get nice and cozy, grab a snack if you need, and let's do this. I'm gonna have one more sip because I've been dehydrating myself, which again, nobody is surprised. Okay, here we go. We're going to start with the preface. Preface. At a moment when Europe is in danger of a catastrophe worse than that of 1914, a book like this may be condemned as a distraction from the desperately urgent defense of civilization against modern barbarism. Year by year, month by month, the plight of our fragmentary and precarious civilization becomes more serious. Fascism abroad grows more bold and ruthless in its foreign ventures, more tyrannical toward its own citizens, more barbarian in its contempt for the life of the mind. Even in our own country, we have reason to fear a tendency toward militarization and the curtailment of civil liberty. Moreover, while the decades pass, no resolute step is taken to alleviate the injustice of our social order. Our outworn economic system dooms millions to frustration. In these conditions, it is difficult for writers to pursue their calling at once with courage and with balanced judgment. Some merely shrug their shoulders and withdraw from the central struggle of our age. These, with their minds closed against the world's most vital issues, inevitably produce works which not only have no depth of significance for their contemporaries, but also are subtly insincere. For these writers must consciously or unconsciously contrive to persuade themselves either that the crisis in human affairs does not exist, or that it is less important than their own work, or that it is, anyhow, not their business. The crisis does exist, is of supreme importance, and concerns us all. Can anyone who is at all intelligent and informed hold the contrary without self-deception? Yet I have a lively sympathy with some of those intellectuals, and intellectuals is in quotes, who declare that they have no useful contribution to make to the struggle, and therefore had better not dabble in it. I am, in fact, one of them. In our defense, I should say that, though we are inactive or ineffective as direct supporters of the cause, we do not ignore it. Indeed, it constantly, obsessively holds our attention. But we are convinced by prolonged trial and error that the most useful service open to us is indirect. For some writers, the case is different. Gallantly plunging into the struggle, they use their powers to spread urgent propaganda, or they even take up arms in the cause. If they have suitable ability, and if the particular struggle in which they serve is in fact a part of the great enterprise of defending or creating civilization, they may, of course, do a valuable work. In addition, they may gain great wealth of experience and human sympathy, thereby immensely increasing their literary power. But the very urgency of their service may tend to blind them to the importance of maintaining and extending, even in this age of crisis, what may be called, metaphorically, the self-critical self-consciousness of the human species, or the attempt to see man's life as a whole in relation to the rest of things. This involves the will to regard all human affairs and ideals and theories with as little human prejudice as possible. Those who are in the thick of the struggle inevitably tend to become, though in a great and just cause, partisan. They nobly forego something of that detachment, that power of cold assessment, which is, after all, among the most valuable human capacities. In their case, this is perhaps as it should be, for a desperate struggle demands less of detachment than of devotion, but some who have the cause at heart must serve by striving to maintain, along with human loyalty, a more dispassionate spirit. And perhaps the attempt to see our turbulent world against a background of stars may, after all, increase, not lessen, the significance of the present human crisis. It may also strengthen our charity toward one another. In this belief, I have tried to construct an imaginative sketch of the dread but vital whole of things. I know well that it is a ludicrously inadequate and in some ways a childish sketch, even when regarded from the angle of contemporary human experience. In a calmer and wiser age, it might well seem crazy. Yet, in spite of its crudity, and in spite of its remoteness, it is perhaps not wholly irrelevant. At the risk of raising thunder both on the left and on the right, I have occasionally used certain ideas and words derived from religion, and I have tried to interpret them in relation to modern needs. The valuable, though much damaged words, spiritual and worship, which have become almost as obscene to the left as the good old sexual words are to the right, are here intended to suggest an experience which the right is apt to pervert and the left to misconceive. This experience, I should say, involves detachment from all private, all social, all racial ends, not in the sense that it leads a man to reject them, but that it makes him prize them in a new way. The spiritual life seems to be in essence the attempt to discover and adopt the attitude which is in fact appropriate to our whole experience, just as admiration is felt to be in fact appropriate towards a well-grown human being. This enterprise can lead to an increased lucidity and finer temper of consciousness, and therefore can have a great and beneficial effect on behavior. Indeed, in this supremely humanizing experience does not produce, along with a kind of piety toward fate, the resolute will to serve our waking humanity. It is a mere sham and a snare. Before closing this preface, I must express my gratitude to Professor L. C. Martin, Mr. L. H. Myers, and Mr. E. V. Ryu for much helpful and sympathetic criticism, in consequence of which I rewrote many chapters. Even now I hesitate to associate their names with such an extravagant work. Judged by the standards of the novel, it is remarkably bad. In fact, it is no novel at all. Certain ideas about artificial planets were suggested by Mr. J.D. Bernal's fascinating little book, The World the flesh, and the devil. I hope he will not strongly disapprove of my treatment of them. My wife, I must thank, both for work on the proofs and for being herself. At the end of the book, I have included a note on magnitude, capital M, magnitude, which may be helpful to readers unfamiliar with astronomy. The very sketchy time scales may amuse some. O.S. March 1937. And that is the end of the preface. Oopsie, oopsie, poopsie. I'm trying to change the page without clicking on any of the links here. There we go. So yeah, that's the end of the preface. I enjoy... So I'm reading another science fiction book right now, The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, and she has almost like the same sort of feel that this preface does, in that though these are taking place on different planets, in different worlds, and different time periods, the commentary is about the now. And I just think that that is so interesting and very true for science fiction, which I love. It's one of my favorite genres. Very exciting. Okay, let's just dive right in. Let's do it. 1. The Earth. The starting point. One night, when I had tasted bitterness, I went out onto the hill. Dark heather checked my feet. Below marched the suburban street lamps. Windows, their curtains drawn, were shut eyes, inwardly watching the lives of dreams. Beyond the sea's level darkness, a lighthouse pulsed. Overhead, obscurity. I distinguished our own house, our islet, in the tumultuous and bitter currents of the world. There, for a decade and a half, we two, so different in quality, had grown in and in to one another for mutual support and nourishment, in intricate symbiosis. There daily we planned our several undertakings, and recounted the day's oddities and vexations. There letters piled up to be answered, socks to be darned. There the children were born, those sudden new lives. There, under that roof, our own two lives, recalcitrant, sometimes to one another, were all the while thankfully one larger, more conscious life than either alone. All this, surely, was good. Yet, there was bitterness, and bitterness not only invaded us from the world, it welled up also within our own magic circle, for horror at our own futility, at our own unreality, and not only at the world's delirium, had driven me out onto the hill. We were always hurrying from one little urgent task to another, but the upshot was insubstantial. Had we, perhaps, misconceived our whole existence? Were we, as it were, living from false premises? And in particular, this partnership of ours, this seemingly so well-based fulcrum for activity in the world, was it after all nothing but a little eddy of complacent and ingrown domesticity, ineffectively whirling on the surface of the great flux, having in itself no depth of being and no significance? Had we perhaps, after all, deceived ourselves? Behind those rapt windows, did we, like so many others, indeed live only a dream? In a sick world, even the hale are sick, and we too, spinning our little life mostly by rote, seldom with clear cognizance, seldom with firm intent, were products of a sick world. Yet this life of ours was not all sheer and barren fantasy. Was it not spun from the actual fibers of reality, which we gathered in with all the comings and goings through our door, all our traffic with the suburb and the city, and with remoter cities, and with the ends of the earth? And were we not spinning together in authentic expression of our own nature? Did not our life issue daily as more or less firm threads of active living and mesh itself into the growing web, the intricate, ever proliferating pattern of mankind? I considered us with quiet interest and a kind of amused awe. How could I describe our relationship, even to myself, without either disparaging it or insulting it with the tawdry decoration of sentimentality? For this our delicate balance of dependence and independence, this coolly critical, shrewdly ridiculing, but loving mutual contact, was surely a microcosm of true community, was, after all, in its simple style, an actual and living example of that high goal which the world seeks. The whole world, the whole universe. Overhead, obscurity unveiled a star. One tremulous arrow of light, projected how many thousands of years ago, now stung my nerves with vision and my heart with fear. For in such a universe as this, what significance could there be in our fortuitous, our frail, our evanescent community? But now irrationally I was seized with a strange worship, not surely of the star, that mere furnace which mere distance falsely sanctified, but of something other, which the dire contrast of the star and us signified to the heart. Yet what? What could thus be signified? Intellect, peering beyond the star, discovered no star-maker, but only darkness. No love, no power even, but nothing. And yet the heart praised. And let me point out that we have already had the titular line in this book, and that gets me so excited. I love finding titular lines. Impatiently, I shook off this folly and reverted from the inscrutable to the familiar and the concrete, thrusting aside worship and fear also and bitterness. I determined to examine more coldly this remarkable us, this surprisingly impressive datum, which to ourselves remained basic to the universe, though in relation to the stars it appeared so slight a thing. Considered, even without reference to our belittling cosmical background, we were, after all, insignificant, perhaps ridiculous. We were such a commonplace occurrence, so trite, so respectable. We were just a married couple, making shift to live together without undue strain. Marriage, in our time, was suspect, and ours, with its trivial romantic origin, was doubly suspect. We had first met when she was a child. Our eyes encountered. She looked at me for a moment with quiet attention. Even I had romantically imagined, with obscure, deep-lying recognition. I, at any rate, recognized in that look, so I persuaded myself in my fever of adolescence, my destiny. Yes, how predestinate had seemed our union. Yet now, in retrospect, how accidental. True, of course, that as a long married couple we fitted rather neatly, like two close trees whose trunks have grown upwards together as a single shaft, mutually distorting, but mutually supporting. Coldly, I now assessed her as merely a useful, but often infuriating adjunct to my personal life. We were on the whole sensible companions. We left one another a certain freedom, and so we were able to endure our proximity. Such was our relationship. Stated thus, it did not seem very significant for the understanding of the universe. Yet in my heart, I knew that it was so. Even the cold stars, even the whole cosmos, with all its inane immensities, could not convince me that this, our prized atom of community, imperfect as it was, short-lived as it must be, was not significant. But could this indescribable union of ours really have any significance at all beyond itself? Did it, for instance, prove that the essential nature to all human beings was to love rather than to hate and fear? Was it evidence that all men and women the world over, though circumstance might prevent them, were at heart capable of supporting a worldwide, love-knit community? And further, did it, being itself a product of the cosmos, prove that love was in some way basic to the cosmos itself? And did it afford, through its own felt intrinsic excellence, some guarantee that we too, its frail supporters, must in some sense have eternal life? Did it, in fact, prove that love was God and God awaiting us in his heaven? No. Our homely, friendly, exasperating, laughter-making, undecorated though most prized community of spirit proved none of those things. It was no certain guarantee of anything but its own imperfect rightness. It was nothing but a very minute, very bright epitome of one out of the many potentialities of existence. I remembered the swarms of the unseeing stars. I remembered the tumult of hate and fear and bitterness which is man's world. I remembered, too, our own not infrequent discordancy. And I reminded myself that we should very soon vanish, like the flurry that a breeze has made on still water. Once more, there came to me a perception of the strange contrast of the stars and us, the incalculable potency of the cosmos mysteriously enhanced the rightness of our brief spark of community and of mankind's brief, uncertain venture. And these in turn quickened the cosmos. I sat down on the heather. Overhead, obscurity was now in full retreat. In its rear, the freed population of the sky sprang out of hiding, star by star. On every side of the shadowy hills or the guest, featureless sea extended beyond the sight. But the hawk flight of imagination followed them as they curved downriver toward the horizon. I perceived that I was on a little round grain of rock and metal, filmed with water and with air, whirling in sunlight and darkness. And on the skin of that little grain all the swarms of men, generation by generation, had lived in labor and blindness, with intermittent joy and intermittent lucidity of spirit. And all their history, with its folk wanderings, its empires, its philosophies, its proud sciences, its social revolutions, its increasing hunger for community, was but a flicker in one day of the lives of stars. If one could know whether among that glittering host there were here and there other spirit-inhabited grains of rock and metal, whether man's blundering search for wisdom and for love was a sole and insignificant tremor or part of a universal movement. Earth among the stars. Overhead, obscurity was gone. From horizon to horizon, the sky was unbroken spread of stars. 2 planets stared, unwinking. The more unobtrusive of the constellations asserted their individuality. Orion's 4 square shoulders and feet, his belt and sword, the plough, the zigzag of Cassiopeia, the intimate Pleiades, all were duly patterned on the dark. The Milky Way, a vague hoop of light, spanned the sky. Imagination completed what mere sight could not achieve. Looking down, I seemed to see through a transparent planet, through heather and solid rock, through buried graveyards of vanished species, down through the molten flow of basalt and on into the earth's core of iron. Then on again, still seemingly downward, through the southern strata to the southern ocean and lands, past the roots of gum trees and the feet of the inverted Antipodians, through their blue, sun-pierced awning of day, and out into the eternal night, where sun and stars are together. For there, dizzyingly far below me, like fishes in the depth of a lake, lay the nether constellations. The two domes of the sky were fused into one hollow sphere, star-peopled, black, even beside the blinding sun. The young moon was a curve of incandescent wire. The completed hoop of the Milky Way encircled the universe. In a strange vertigo, I looked for reassurance at the little glowing window of our home. There they still were, and the whole suburb and the hills, but stars shone through all. It was as though all terrestrial things were made of glass, or of some sort limpid, more ethereal vitreosity. Faintly the church clock chimed for midnight. Dimly, receding, it rolled the first stroke. Imagination was now stimulated to a new, strange mode of perception. Looking from star to star, I see the heaven no longer as a jeweled ceiling and floor, but as depth beyond flashing depths of suns. And though for the most part of the great and familiar lights of the sky stood forth as our near neighbors, some brilliant stars were seen to be in fact remote and mighty, while some dim lamps were visibly only because they were so near. On every side, the middle distance was crowded with swarms and streams of stars, but even these now seemed near, for the Milky Way had receded into an incomparably greater distance, and through gaps in its nearer parts appeared vista beyond vista of luminous mists and deep perspectives of stellar populations. The universe in which fate had set me was no spangled chamber, but a perceived vortex of star streams. No, it was more. Peering between the stars into the outer darkness, I saw also, as mere flecks and points of light, other such vortices, such galaxies, sparsely scattered in the void, depth beyond depth, so far afield that even the eye of imagination could find no limits to the cosmical, the all-embracing galaxy of galaxies. The universe now appeared to me as a void wherein floated rare flakes of snow, each flake a universe. Gazing at the faintest and remotest of all the swarm of universes, I seemed, by hypertelescopic imagination, to see it as a population of suns, and near one of those suns was a planet, and on that planet's dark side a hill, and on that hill myself. For our astronomers assure us that in this boundless finitude which we call the cosmos, the straight lines of light lead not to infinity, but to other sources. Then I remembered that, had my vision depended on physical light and not the light of imagination, the rays coming thus to me round the cosmos would have revealed, not myself, but events that had ceased long before the earth, or even, perhaps, the sun was formed. But now, once more shunning these immensities, I looked again for the curtained windows of our home, which, though star-pierced, was still more real to me than all the galaxies. But our home had vanished, with the whole suburb, and the hills too, and the sea. The very ground on which I had been sitting was gone. Instead, there lay far below me an insubstantial gloom, and I myself was seemingly disembodied, for I could neither see nor touch my own flesh. And when I willed to move my limbs, nothing happened. I had no limbs. The familiar inner perceptions of my body and the headache which had oppressed me since morning had given way to a vague lightness and exhilaration. When I realized fully the change that had come over me, I wondered if I had died and was entering some wholly unexpected new existence. Such a banal possibility at first exasperated me. Then, with sudden dismay, I understood that if I indeed, oops, that if indeed I had died, I should not return to my prized, concrete atom of community. The violence of my distress shocked me, but soon I comforted myself with the thought that after all I was probably not dead, but in some sort of trance, from which I might wake at any minute. I resolved, therefore, not to be unduly alarmed by this mysterious change. With scientific interest, I would observe all that happened to me. I noticed that the obscurity which had taken the place of the ground was shrinking and condensing. The nether stars were no longer visible through it. Soon the earth below me was like a huge circular tabletop, a broad disk of darkness surrounded by stars. I was apparently soaring away from my native planet at incredible speed. The sun, formerly visible to imagination in the nether heaven, was once more physically eclipsed by the earth. Though by now I must have been hundreds of miles above the ground, I was not troubled by the absence of oxygen and atmospheric pressure. I experienced only an increasing exhilaration and a delightful effervescence of thought. The extraordinary brilliance of the stars excited me, for, whether through the absence of obscuring air or through my own increased sensitivity, or both, the sky had taken on an unfamiliar aspect. Every star had seemingly flared up into higher magnitude. The heavens blazed. The major stars were like the headlights of a distant car. The Milky Way, no longer watered down with darkness, was an encircling, granular river of light. Presently, along the planet's eastern limb, now far below me, there appeared a faint line of luminosity, which, as I continued to soar, warmed here and there, orange and red. Evidently, I was traveling not only upwards but eastwards, and swinging round into the day. Soon the sun leapt into view, devouring the huge crescent of dawn with its brilliance. But as I sped on, sun and planet were seen to drift apart, while the thread of dawn thickened into a misty breadth of sunlight. This increased, like a visibly waxing moon, till half the planet was illuminated. Between the areas of night and day, a belt of shade, warm-tinted, broad as a subcontinent, now marked the area of dawn. As I continued to rise and travel eastward, I saw the lands swing westward along with the day, till I was over the Pacific and high noon. The earth appeared now as a great bright orb hundreds of times larger than the full moon. In its center, a dazzling patch of light was the sun's image reflected in the ocean. The planet's circumference was an indefinite breadth of luminous haze, fading into the surrounding blackness of space. Much of the northern hemisphere, tilted somewhat toward me, was an expanse of snow and cloud tops. I could trace parts of the outlines of Japan and China. Their vague browns and greens indented the vague blues and grays of the ocean. Toward the equator, where the air was clearer, the ocean was dark. A little whirl of brilliant cloud was perhaps the upper surface of a hurricane. The Philippines and New Guinea were precisely mapped. Australia faded into the hazy southern limb. The spectacle before me was strangely moving. Personal anxiety was blotted out by wonder and admiration, for the sheer beauty of our planet surprised me. It was a huge pearl set in spangled ebony. It was nacreous, it was an opal. No, it was far more lovely than any jewel. Its patterned coloring was more subtle, more ethereal. It displayed the delicacy and brilliance, the intricacy and harmony of a live thing. Strange that in my remoteness I seemed to feel, as never before, the vital presence of earth, as of a creature alive but tranced and obscurely yearning to wake. I reflected that not one of the visible features of this celestial and living gem revealed the presence of man. Displayed before me, though invisible, were some of the most congested centers of human population. There below me lay huge industrial regions, blackening the air with smoke. Yet all this thronging life and humanly momentous enterprise had made no mark whatever on the features of the planet. From this high lookout, the earth would have appeared no different before the dawn of man. No visiting angel or explorer from another planet could have guessed that this bland orb teemed with vermin, with world-mastering, self-torturing, incipiently angelic beasts. And that is the end of chapter 1. All right, so we got some existential dread. Uh, let's see. So we don't know who our narrator or who our main character is, but he is walking in the middle of the night up to a hill, and he's just observing and just seeing how small everything is compared to the universe and the vast cosmos, and compares, his home to this and his relationship to this. And like, while it is, strange that they are married and also that they love each other, it's really of no consequence to anything besides to their lives. And then it gets weird. I'm guessing that he's not literally traveling around the world. I'm thinking that as he's laying on the hill and looking up, that this is all in his head. He did mention having like a weird head situation going on, like a headache, and was feeling a little off, but then he's sort of like traveling around the world, so to speak, and just seeing how beautiful everything is. And then there's that line at the very end about humans that the orb is teeming with vermin, with world mastering, self torturing, incipiently angelic beasts. And that is just cool. Because, yes, that is exactly what humans are. You would think so, but no, this was written in 1937. Vermins equals more space babes. We very well might get more space babes. It does look very 80s. I think this cover was from the 80s, but yeah, the book was from 37. This was just the first cover I saw. I don't even think it's the cover of the edition that I'm reading. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think so. Yeah, an 80s edition. Yep, yep. Whatever you call it. I was following you. I was following along with you. All right, let's do it. Chapter 2. Interstellar Travel. While I was thus contemplating my native planet, I continued to soar through space. The Earth was visibly shrinking into the distance, and as I raced eastward, it seemed to be rotating beneath me. All its features swung westward, till presently sunset and the mid-Atlantic appeared upon its eastern limb, and then the night. Within a few minutes, as it seemed to me, the planet had become an immense half-moon. Soon it was a misty, dwindling crescent, beside the sharp and minute crescent of its satellite. With amazement, I realized that I must be traveling at a quite impossible rate. So rapid was my progress that I seemed to be passing through a constant hail of meteors. They were invisible till they were almost abreast of me, for they shone only by reflected sunlight, appearing for an instant only, as streaks of light, like lamps seen from an express train. Many of them I met in head-on collision, but they made no impression on me. One huge irregular bulk of rock, the size of a house, thoroughly terrified me. The illuminated mass swelled before my gaze, displayed for a fraction of a second a rough and lumpy surface, and then engulfed me. Or rather, I infer that it must have engulfed me, but so swift was my passage that I had no sooner seen it in the middle distance than I found myself already leaving it behind. Very soon, the earth was a mere star. I say soon, but my sense of the passage of time was now very confused. Minutes and hours, and perhaps even days, even weeks, were now indistinguishable. While I was still trying to collect myself, I found that I was already beyond the orbit of Mars and rushing across the thoroughfare of the asteroids. Some of these tiny planets were now so near that they appeared as guest stars streaming across the constellations. One or two revealed gibbous, then crescent forms before they faded behind me. Already Jupiter, far ahead of me, grew increasingly bright and shifted its position among the fixed stars. The great globe now appeared as a disk, which soon was larger than the shrinking sun. Its 4 major satellites were little pearls floating beside it. The planet's surface now appeared like streaky bacon by reason of its cloud zones. Clouds fogged its whole circumference. Now I drew abreast of it and past it. Owing to the immense depth of its atmosphere, night and day merged into one another without assignable boundary. I noted here and there on its eastern and unilluminated hemisphere vague areas of ruddy light, which were perhaps the glow cast upward through dense cloud by volcanic upheavals. In a few minutes, or perhaps years, Jupiter had become once more a star, and then was lost in the splendor of the diminished but still blazing sun. No other of the outer planets lay near my course, but I soon realized that I must be far beyond the limits of even Pluto's orbit. The sun was now merely the brightest of the stars, fading behind me. At last I had time for distress. Nothing now was visible but the starry sky, Kepler, Cassiopeia, Orion, the Pleiades, mocked me with their familiarity and their remoteness. The sun was now but one among the other bright stars. Nothing changed. Was I doomed to hang thus forever out in space, a bodiless point of view? Had I died? Was this my punishment for a singularly ineffectual life? Was this the penalty of an inveterate will to remain detached from human affairs and passions and prejudices? In imagination, I struggled back to my suburban hilltop. I saw our home. The door opened. A figure came out into the garden, lit by the hall light. She stood for a moment, looking up and down the road, then went back into the house. But all this was imagination only. In actuality, there was nothing but the stars. After a while, I noticed that the sun and all the stars in his neighborhood were ruddy. Those at the opposite pole of the heaven were an icy blue. The explanation of this strange phenomenon flashed upon me. I was traveling, and traveling so fast that light itself was not wholly indifferent to my passage. The overtaking undulations took long to catch me. They therefore affected me as slower pulsations than they normally were, and I saw them, therefore, as red. Those that met me on my headlong flight were congested and shortened, and were seen as blue. Very soon the heavens presented an extraordinary appearance, for all the stars directly behind me were now deep red, while those directly ahead were violet. Rubies lay behind me, amethysts ahead of me. Surrounding the ruby constellations there spread an area of topaz stars, and round the amethyst constellations an area of sapphires. Beside my course, on every side, the colors faded into the normal white of the sky's familiar diamonds. Since I was traveling almost in the plane of the galaxy, the hoop of the Milky Way, white on either hand, was violet ahead of me, red behind. Presently, the stars immediately before and behind grew dim, then vanished, leaving two starless holes in the heaven, each hole surrounded by a zone of colored stars. Evidently, I was still gathering speed. Light from the forward and the hinder stars now reached me in forms beyond the range of my human vision. As my speed increased, the two starless patches, before and behind, each with its colored fringe, continued to encroach upon the intervening zone of normal stars, which lay abreast of me on every side. Amongst these I now detected movement. Through the effect of my own passage, the nearer stars appeared to drift across the background of the stars at greater distance. This drifting accelerated till, for an instant, the whole visible sky was streaked with flying stars. Then everything vanished. Presumably my speed was so great in relation to the stars that light from none of them could take normal effect on me. Though I was now perhaps traveling faster than light itself, I seemed to be floating at the bottom of a deep and stagnant well. The featureless darkness, the complete lack of all sensation, terrified me, if I can call terror, the repugnance and foreboding which I now experienced without any of the bodily accompaniments of terror, without any sensation of trembling, sweating, gasping, or palpitation. Forlornly and with self-pity I longed for home, and longed to see once more the face that I knew best. With the mind's eye I could see her now, sitting by the fire sewing, a little furrow of anxiety between her brows. Was my body, I wondered, lying dead on the heather? Would they find it there in the morning? How would she confront this great change in her life? Certainly, with a brave face. But she would suffer. But even while I was desperately rebelling against the dissolution of our treasured atom of community, I was aware that something within me, the essential spirit within me, willed very emphatically not to retreat, but to press on with this amazing voyage. Not that my longing for the familiar human world could for a moment be counterbalanced by a mere craving for adventure. I was of too home-keeping a kind to seek serious danger and discomfort for their own sake, but timidity was overcome by a sense of the opportunity that fate was giving me, not only to explore the depths of the physical universe, but to discover what part life and mind were actually playing among the stars. A keen hunger now took possession of me, a hunger not for adventure but for insight into the significance of man, or of any man-like beings in the cosmos. This homely treasure of ours, this frank and spring-making daisy beside the arid track of modern life, impelled me to accept gladly my strange adventure, for might I not discover that the whole universe was no mere place of dust and ashes, with here and there a stunted life, but actually, beyond the parched terrestrial wasteland, a world of flowers. Thank you for the hydrate. I will take you up on that. Was man, indeed, as he sometimes desired to be, the growing point of the cosmical spirit, in its temporal aspect at least? Or was he one of many million growing points? Or was mankind of no more importance in the universal view than rats in a cathedral? And again, was man's true function power, or wisdom, or love, or worship, or all of these? Or was the idea of function, of purpose, meaningless in relation to the cosmos? These grave questions I would answer. Also, I must learn to see a little more clearly and confront a little more rightly, so I put it to myself, that which, when we glimpse it at all, compels our worship. Now I seemed to my self-important self to be no isolated individual, craving aggrandizement, but rather an emissary of mankind. No, an organ of exploration, a feeler, projected by the living human world to make contact with its fellows in space. At all cost, I must go forward, even if my trivial earthly life must come to an untimely end, and my wife and children be left without me. I must go forward, and somehow, someday, even if after centuries of interstellar travel, I must return. When I look back on that phase of exaltation, now that I have indeed returned to Earth after the most bewildering adventures, I am dismayed at the contrast between the spiritual treasure which I aspired to hand over to my fellow men and the paucity of my actual tribute. This failure was perhaps due to the fact that, though I did indeed accept the challenge of the adventure, I accepted it only with secret reservations. Fear and the longing for comfort, I now recognized, dimmed the brightness of my will. My resolution, so boldly formed, proved after all frail. My unsteady courage often gave place to yearnings for my native planet. Over and over again in the course of my travels, I had a sense that, owing to my timid and pedestrian nature, I missed the most significant aspects of events. Of all that I experienced on my travels, only a fraction was clearly intelligible to me even at the time, and then, as I shall tell, my native powers were aided by beings of superhuman development. Now that I am once more on my native planet, and this aid is no longer available, I cannot recapture even so much of the deeper insight as I formerly attained. And so my record, which tells of the most far-reaching of all human explorations, turns out to be, after all, no more reliable than the rigmarole of any mind unhinged by the impact of experience beyond its comprehension. To return to my story, how long I spent in debate with myself I do not know, but soon after I had made my decision, the absolute darkness was pierced once more by the stars. I was apparently at rest, for stars were visible in every direction, and their color was normal. But a mysterious change had come over me. I soon discovered that, by merely willing to approach a star, I could set myself in motion toward it, and at such a speed that I must have traveled much faster than normal light. This, as I knew very well, was physically impossible. Scientists had assured me that motion faster than the speed of light was meaningless. I inferred that my motion must therefore be in some manner a mental, not a physical phenomenon, that I was enabled to take up successive viewpoints without physical means of locomotion. It seemed to me evident, too, that the light with which the stars were now revealed to me was not normal, physical light, for I noticed that my new and expeditious means of travel took no effect upon the visible colors of the stars. However fast I moved, they retained their diamond hues, though all were somewhat brighter and more tinted than in normal vision. No sooner had I made sure of my new power of locomotion than I began feverishly to use it. I told myself that I was embarking on a voyage of astronomical and metaphysical research, but already my craving for the earth was distorting my purpose. It turned my attention unduly toward the search for planets, and especially for planets of the terrestrial type. At random, I directed my course toward one of the brighter of the nearer stars. So rapid was my advance that certain lesser and still nearer luminaries streamed past me like meteors. I swung close to the great sun, insensitive to its heat. On its mottled surface, in spite of the pervading brilliance, I could see, with my miraculous vision, a group of huge, dark sunspots, each one a pit into which a dozen Earths could have been dropped. Round the star's limb, the excrescences. That is not how you say that word. So the fun thing about reading things out loud is that you come across all these words that you've literally never had to say out loud. Excrescences. A disfiguring or unwanted mark or adjunct. Yeah, you come across all these words that you've never had to say out loud. You know what they mean, but you just bypass them because your brain just do. So that's fun. Round the star's limb of excrescences of the chromosphere looked like fiery trees and plumes of prehistoric monsters. A tiptoe or awing, all on a globe too small for them. Beyond these, a pale corona spread its film into the darkness. As I rounded the star in hyperbolic flight, I searched anxiously for planets, but found none. You haven't seen that one before? Okay, cool. Not just me. I searched again, meticulously, tacking and veering near and far. In the wider orbits, a small object like the Earth might easily be overlooked. I found nothing but meteors and a few insubstantial comets. This was the more disappointing, because the star seemed to be of much the same type as the familiar sun. Secretly, I had hoped to discover not merely planets, but actually the Earth. Once more, I struck out into the ocean of space, heading for another near star. Once more, I was disappointed. I approached yet another lonely surface. This, too, was unattended by the minute grains that harbor life. I now hurried from star to star, a lost dog looking for its master. I rushed hither and thither, intent on finding a sun with planets, and among those planets, my home. Star after star I searched, but far more I passed impatiently, recognizing at once that they were too large and tenuous and young to be Earth's luminary. Some were vague, ruddy giants, broader than the orbit of Jupiter. Some, smaller and more definite, had the brilliance of 1,000 suns, and their color was blue. I had been told that our sun was of average type, But I now discovered many more of the great youngsters than of the shrunken, yellowish, middle-aged. Seemingly, I must have strayed into a region of late stellar condensation. I noticed, but only to avoid them, great clouds of dust, huge as constellations, eclipsing the star streams, and tracts of palely glowing gas, shining sometimes by their own light, sometimes by the reflected light of stars. Often these nacrous cloud continents had secreted within them a number of vague pearls of light, the embryos of future stars. I glanced heedlessly at many star couples, trios, and quartets, in which more or less equal partners waltz in close union. Once, and once only, I came on one of those rare couples in which one partner is no bigger than a mere earth, but massive as a whole great star, and very brilliant. Up and down this region of the galaxy, I found here and there a dying star, somberly smoldering, and here and there the encrusted and extinguished dead. These I could not see till I was almost upon them, and then only dimly, by the reflected light of the whole heaven. I never approached nearer to them than I could help, for they were of no interest to me in my crazy yearning for the earth. Moreover, they struck a chill into my mind, prophesying the universal death. I was comforted, however, to find that as yet there were so few of them. I found no planets. I knew well that the birth of planets was due to the close approach of two or more stars, and that such accidents must be very common. I reminded myself that stars with planets must be as rare in the galaxy as gems among the grains of sand on the seashore. What chance had I of coming upon one? I began to lose heart. The appalling desert of darkness and bearing fire, the huge emptiness so sparsely prickled with scintillations, the colossal futility of the whole universe hideously oppressed me. And now, in added distress, my power of locomotion began to fail. Only with a great effort could I move at all among the stars, and then but slowly, and ever more slowly. Soon I should find myself pinned fast in space like a fly in a collection, but lonely, eternally alone. Yes, surely this was my special hell. I pulled myself together. I reminded myself that even if this was to be my fate, it was no great matter. The earth could very well do without me, and even if there was no other living world anywhere in the cosmos, still, the earth itself had life, and might wake to far fuller life. And even though I had lost my native planet, still, that beloved world was real. Besides, my whole adventure was a miracle, and by continued miracle might I not stumble on some other earth? I remembered that I had undertaken a high pilgrimage, and that I was man's emissary to the stars. With returning courage, my power of locomotion returned. Evidently, it depended on vigorous and self-detached mentality. A recent mood of self-pity and earthward yearning had hampered it. Resolving to explore a new region of the galaxy, where perhaps there would be more of the older stars and a greater hope of planets, I headed in the direction of a remote and populous cluster. From the faintest of the individual members of this vaguely speckled ball of light, I guessed that it must be very far afield. On and on I traveled in the darkness, as I never turned aside to search. My course through the ocean of space never took me near enough to any star to reveal it as a disk. The lights of heaven streamed remotely past me like the lights of distant ships. After a voyage during which I lost all measure of time, I found myself in a great desert, empty of stars, a gap between two star streams, a cleft in the galaxy. The Milky Way surrounded me, and in all directions lay the normal dust of distant stars. But there were no considerable lights, save the thistledown of the remote cluster which was my goal. This unfamiliar sky disturbed me with a sense of my increasing dissociation from my home. It was almost a comfort to note, beyond the furthest stars of our galaxy, minute smudges that were alien galaxies, incomparably more distant than the deepest recesses of the Milky Way, and to be reminded that, in spite of all my headlong and miraculous traveling, I was still within my native galaxy, within the same little cell of the cosmos where she, my life's friend, still lived. I was surprised, by the way, that so many of the alien galaxies appeared to the naked eye, and that the largest was a pale, cloudy mark bigger than the moon in the terrestrial sky. By contrast with the remote galaxies on whose appearance all my voyaging failed to make impression, the star cluster ahead of me was now visibly expanding. Soon after I had crossed the great emptiness between the star streams, my cluster confronted me as a huge cloud of brilliance. Presently I was passing through a more populous area, and then the cluster itself opened out ahead of me, covering the whole forward sky with its congested lights. As a ship approaching port encounters other craft, so I came upon and passed star after star. When I had penetrated into the heart of the cluster, I was in a region far more populous than any that I had explored. On every side, the sun blazed with suns, the sky blazed with suns, many of which appeared far brighter than Venus in the Earth's sky. I felt the exhilaration of a traveler who, after an ocean crossing, enters harbor by night and finds himself surrounded by the lights of a metropolis. In this congested region, I told myself, many close approaches must have occurred. Many planetary systems must have been formed. Once more I looked for middle-aged stars of the sun's type. All that I had passed hitherto were young giants, great as the whole solar system. After further searching, I found a few likely stars, but none had planets. I found also many double and triple stars, describing their incalculable orbits and great continents of gas in which new stars were condensing. At last, I found a planetary system. With almost insupportable hope, I circled among these worlds. But all were greater than Jupiter, and all were molten. Again, I hurried from star to star. I must have visited thousands, but all in vain. Sick and lonely, I fled out of the cluster. It dwindled behind me into a ball of down, sparkling with dewdrops. In front of me, a great tract of darkness blotted out a section of the Milky Way and the neighboring area of stars, save for a few near lights which lay between me and the obscuring opacity. The billowing edges of this huge cloud of gas or dust were revealed by the glancing rays of bright stars beyond it. The sight moved me with self-pity. On so many nights at home, I had seen the edges of dark clouds silvered just so by moonlight. But the cloud which now opposed me could have swallowed not merely whole worlds, not merely countless planetary systems, but whole constellations. Once more my courage failed me. Miserably, I tried to shout out the immensities by closing my eyes, but I had neither eyes nor eyelids. I was a disembodied, wandering viewpoint. I tried to conjure up the little interior of my home, with the curtains drawn and the fire dancing. I tried to persuade myself that all this horror of darkness and distance and barren incandescence was a dream, that I was dozing by the fire, that at any moment I might wake. that she would reach over from her sewing and touch me and smile. But the stars still held me prisoner. Again, though without failing strength, I set about my search. And after I had wandered from star to star for a period that might have been days or years or eons, luck or some guardian spirit directed me to a certain sun-like star, and looking outwards from its center, I caught sight of a little point of light, moving, with my movement, against the patterned sky. As I leapt toward it, I saw another, and another. Here was indeed a planetary system much like my own. So obsessed was I with human standards that I sought out at once the most Earth-like of these worlds, and amazingly Earth-like it appeared, as its disk swelled before me or below me. Its atmosphere was evidently less dense than ours, for the outlines of unfamiliar continents and oceans were very plainly visible. As on Earth, the dark sea brilliantly reflected the sun's image. White cloud tracks lay here and there over the seas and the lands which, as on my own planet, were mottled green and brown. But even from this height I saw that the greens were more vivid and far more blue than terrestrial vegetation. I noted, also, that on this planet there was less ocean than land, and that the centers of the great continents were chiefly occupied by dazzling, creamy white deserts. And that is the end of chapter 2. Amazing. Okay, so I am really enjoying the writing style. It's, yes, it's science fiction, but it's almost like fantastical in the way that it's written. It was definitely a long chapter, yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. And this next one is even longer. Okay, so the last chapter, it says it was going to take me 22 minutes. This chapter, which it looks like it's going to be divided in parts, whereas the last one wasn't, but this chapter is going to be an hour and 19 minutes. So we might only read one more chapter tonight. But yeah, I am really enjoying it, and I think it is so interesting, of course, to see like how small you are in the cosmos, the world, everything like that. But then also, like, as you're exploring all of these worlds, like, you still are looking for things that are recognizable, familiar. Like, instead of going to a planet that is like Jupiter, or a galaxy that doesn't have planets anything like our solar system, it's interesting that, like, our character, who we still don't have a name for, is searching for this and has mentioned that this is all in their head, and that sometimes they get glimpses of, like, being back at home, or being even just back on the hill and, like, looking up at the stars. But yeah, it's just so interesting. And, like, the callback to, like, you are in this place that you've never seen before. You are traveling literally galaxies, and you are searching for home. Like, and home for our main character is their wife, their partner. And I just think that that is very powerful, very strong. I don't know. And I'm sure that there's a lot of other things going on that I haven't uh, dived. I haven't springboarded into. But yeah, I'm super enjoying the writing. Yeah, you're liking the writing, and it is good for listening. I feel so too, and I think part of that is because there isn't dialogue, or at least there hasn't been yet, and it is, action and internal thought. And that in itself just lends itself to being easier to listen to, if that makes sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Okay, let's have a sip because these chapters are so long. All right, chapter 3, The Other Earth. Part 1. On the Other Earth. As I slowly descended toward the surface of the little planet, I found myself searching for a land which promised to be like England. But no sooner did I realize what I was doing than I reminded myself that conditions here would be entirely different from terrestrial conditions, and that it was very unlikely that I should find intelligent beings at all. If such beings existed, they would probably be quite incomprehensible to me. Perhaps they would be huge spiders or creepy jellies. How could I hope ever to make contact with such monsters? Very intriguing to see into. Yes, yeah, for sure, Carno. Wonder what the law. Oh my gosh, I don't know. Well, and like reading it out loud, you read a lot slower than if you're just like reading it in your head. I don't know. After circling about at random for some time over the flimsy clouds and the forests, over the dappled plains and prairies and the dazzling stretches of desert, I selected a maritime country in the temperate zone, a brilliantly green peninsula. When I had descended almost to the ground, I was amazed at the verdure of the countryside. Here, unmistakably, was vegetation, similar to ours in essential character, but quite unfamiliar in detail. The fat, or even bulbous, leaves reminded me of our desert flora, but here the stems were lean and wiry. Perhaps the most striking character of this vegetation was its color, which was a vivid blue-green, like the color of vineyards that have been treated with copper salts. I was to discover later that the plants of this world had indeed learnt to protect themselves by means of copper sulfate from the microbes and the insect-like pests which formerly devastated this rather dry planet. I skimmed over a brilliant prairie scattered with Prussian blue bushes. The sky also attained a depth of blue quite unknown on Earth, save at great altitudes. There were a few low yet cirrus clouds whose feathery character I took to be due to the tenuousness of the atmosphere. This was borne out by the fact that, though my descent had taken place in the forenoon of a summer's day, several stars managed to pierce the almost nocturnal sky. All exposed surfaces were very intensely illuminated. The shadows of the nearer bushes were nearly black. Some distant objects, rather like buildings, but probably mere rocks, appeared to be blocked out in ebony and snow. Altogether, the landscape was one of unearthly and fantastical beauty. I glided with wingless flight over the surface of the planet, through glades, across tracts of fractured rock, along the banks of streams. Presently, I came to a wide region covered by neat, parallel rows of fern-like plants, bearing masses of nuts on the lower surfaces of their leaves. It was almost impossible to believe that this vegetable regimentation had not been intelligently planned. Or could it, after all, be merely a natural phenomenon not known on my own planet? Such was my surprise that my power of locomotion, always subject to emotional interference, now began to fail me. I reeled in the air like a drunk man, pulling myself together. I staggered on over the ranked crops toward a rather large object which lay some distance from me, beside a strip of bare ground. Presently, to my amazement, my stupefaction, this object revealed itself as a plow. Plow. It was rather a weird instrument, but there was no mistaking the shape of the blade, which was rusty and obviously made of iron. There were 2 iron handles and chains for attachment to a beast of draught. It was difficult to believe that I was many light years distant from England. Looking round, I saw an unmistakable cart track and a bit of dirty ragged cloth hanging on a bush. Yet overhead was the unearthly sky, full noon, with stars. I followed the lane through a little wood of strange bushes, whose large fat droppings leaves had cherry-like fruits along their edges. Suddenly, round a bend in the lane, I came upon a man, or so at first he seemed to my astounded and star-weary sight. I should not have been so surprised by the strangely human character of this creature had I, at this early stage, understood the forces that controlled my adventure. Influences which I shall later describe doomed me to discover first such worlds as were not akin to my own. Meanwhile, the reader may well conceive my amazement at this strange encounter. I had always supposed that man was a unique being. An inconceivably complex conjunction of circumstances had produced him, and it was not to be supposed that such conditions would be repeated anywhere in the universe. Yet here, on the very first globe to be explored, was an obvious peasant. Approaching him, I saw that he was not quite so like terrestrial man as he seemed at a distance, but he was a man for all that. Had God, then, peopled the whole universe with our kind? Did he, perhaps, in very truth make us in his image? It was incredible. To ask such questions proved that I had lost my mental balance. As I was a mere disembodied viewpoint, I was able to observe without being observed. I floated about him as he strode along the lane. He was an erect biped, and in general plan definitely human. I had no means of judging his height, but he must have been approximately of normal terrestrial stature, or at least not smaller than a pygmy, and not taller than a giant. He was of slender build. His legs were almost like a bird's, and enclosed in rough, narrow trousers. Above the waist he was naked, displaying a disproportionately large thorax, shaggy, with greenish hair. He had 2 short but powerful arms and huge shoulder muscles. His skin was dark and ruddy and dusted plentifully with bright green down. All his contours were uncouth, for the details of muscles, sinews, and joints were very plainly different from our own. His neck was curiously long and supple. His head I can best describe by saying that most of the brain pan, covered with a green thatch, seemed to have slipped backwards and downwards over the nape. His 2 very human eyes peered from under the eaves of hair. An oddly projecting, almost spout-like mouth made him look as though he were whistling. Between the eyes, and rather above them, was a pair of great equine noses, which were constantly in motion. I'm going to try that sentence again because I said it wrong, and it makes no sense the way I said it. Between the eyes, and rather above them, was a pair of great equine nostrils, which were constantly in motion. The bridge of the nose was represented by an elevation in the thatch, reaching from the nostrils backwards over the top of the head. There were no visible ears. I discovered later that the auditory organs opened into the nostrils. Clearly, although evolution on this Earth-like planet must have taken a course on the whole surprisingly like that which had produced my own kind, there must also have been many divergencies. The stranger wore not only boots but gloves, seemingly of rough leather. His boots were extremely short. I was to discover later that the feet of this race, the other men, as I called them, were rather like the feet of an ostrich or a camel. The instep consisted of 3 great toes grown together. In place of the heel, there was an additional broad, stumpy toe. The hands were without palms. Each was a bunch of 3 gristly fingers and a thumb. I'm just picturing what this looks like. What a great description, too. And I like that it's like humanoid, but there are definite evolutionary differences. And I just think that's so fascinating. The aim of this book is not to tell of my own adventures, but to give some idea of the worlds which I visited. I shall therefore not recount in detail how I established myself among the other men. Of myself, it is enough to say a few words. When I had studied this agriculturalist for a while, I began to be strangely oppressed by his complete unawareness of myself. With painful clearness, I realized that the purpose of my pilgrimage was not merely scientific observation, but also the need to effect some kind of mental and spiritual traffic with other worlds, for mutual enrichment and community. How should I ever be able to achieve this end unless I could find some means of communication? It was not until I had followed my companion to his home and had spent many days in that circular stone house with roof of mudded wicker that I discovered the power of entering into his mind, of seeing through his eyes, sensing through all his sense organs, perceiving his world just as he perceived it, and following much of his thought and his emotional life, not till very much later, when I had passively inhabited many individuals of the race, did I discover how to make my presence known, and even to converse inwardly with my host. You too, yeah, very cool description of a convergent Evaldalian. Yeah, super interesting. This kind of internal telepathic intercourse, which was to serve me in all my wanderings, was at first difficult, ineffective, and painful. But in time I came to be able to live through the experiences of my host with vividness and accuracy, while yet preserving my own individuality, my own critical intelligence, my own desires and fears. Only when the other had come to realize my presence within him could he, by a special act of volition, keep particular thoughts secret from me. It can well be understood that at first I found these alien minds quite unintelligible. Their very sensations differed from my familiar sensations in important respects. Their thoughts and all their emotions and sentiments were strange to me. The traditional groundwork of these minds, their most familiar concepts, were derived from a strange history and expressed in languages which to the terrestrial mind were subtly misleading. I spent on the other earth many other years, wandering from mind to mind and country to country, but I did not gain any clear understanding of the psychology of the other men, and the significance of their history till I had encountered one of their philosophers, an aging but still vigorous man whose eccentric and unpalatable views had prevented him from attaining eminence. Most of my hosts, when they became aware of my presence within them, regarded me either as an evil spirit or as a divine messenger. The more sophisticated, however, assumed that I was a mere disease, a symptom of insanity in themselves. They moreover promptly applied to the local mental sanitation officer. After I had spent, according to the local calendar, a year or so of bitter loneliness among minds who refused to treat me as a human being, I had the good fortune to come under the philosopher's notice. One of my hosts, who complained of suffering from voices and visions of another world, appealed to the old man for help. Oh man, I am totally gonna say this name wrong. B as in boy, V as in Victor, A L L T as in Tom, U. Valtu? That's what we're gonna go with. And it may be different every single time I say it, but we'll see. Okay. Valtu, for such approximately was the philosopher's name. The LL, oh my gosh, and then it just tells you how to say it. The LL being pronounced more or less as in Welsh. Valtu effected a cure by merely inviting me to accept the hospitality of his own mind, where, he said, he would very gladly entertain me. It was with extravagant joy that I made contact at last with a being who recognized in me a human personality. Okay, the first part of chapter 3 has ended, so I'm going to take a quick drink of water. Why didn't I think about it? Just pronounce it like the Welsh. Duh. It's fine. Alright, part 2. A busy world. So many important characteristics of this world society need to be described that I cannot spend much time on the more obvious features of the planet and its race. Civilization had reached a stage of growth much like that which was familiar to me. I was constantly surprised by the blend of similarity and difference. Traveling over the planet, I found that cultivation had spread over most of the suitable areas, and that industrialism was already far advanced in many countries. On the prairies, huge flocks of mammal-like creatures grazed and scampered. Larger mammals, or quasi-mammals, were farmed on all the best pasture land for food and leather. I say quasi-mammal because, though these creatures were viviparous, they did not suckle. They chewed cud, chemically treated in the maternal belly, was spat into the offspring's mouth as a jet of pre-digested fluid. It was thus also that human mothers fed their young. The most important means of locomotion on the other Earth was the steam train, but trains in this world were so bulky that they looked like whole terraces of houses on the move. This remarkable railway development was probably due to the great number and length of journeys across deserts. Occasionally, I traveled on steamships, on the few and small oceans, but marine transport was on the whole backward. The screw propeller was unknown, its place being taken by paddle wheels. Internal combustion engines were used in road and desert transport. Flying, owing to the rarefied atmosphere, had not been achieved, but rocket propulsion was already used for long-distance transport of mails and for long-range bombardment in war. Its application to aeronautics might come any day. My first visit to the metropolis of one of the great empires of the other Earth was an outstanding experience. Everything was at once so strange and so familiar. There were streets and many windowed stores and offices. In this old city, the streets were narrow, and so congested was the motor traffic that pedestrians were accommodated on special elevated tracks slung beside the first-story windows and across the streets. The crowds that streamed along these footpaths were as variegated as our own. The men wore cloth tunics and trousers surprisingly like the trousers of Europe, save that the crease affected by the respectable was at the side of the leg. That's hilarious. The crease is not in the middle like in Europe of the regular Earth. The crease is on the side. Hilarious. The women, breastless and high-nostrilled like the men, were to be distinguished by their more tubular lips, whose biological function it was to project food for the infant. In place of skirts, they disported green and glossy silk tights and little gaudy knickers. To my unaccustomed vision, the effect was inexpressibly vulgar. In summer, both sexes often appeared in the streets naked to the waist. They always wore gloves. Here, then, was a host of persons who, in spite of their oddity, were as essentially human as Londoners. They went about their private affairs with complete assurance, ignorant that a spectator from another world found them one and all grotesque. With their lack of forehead, their great elevated quivering nostrils, their startlingly human eyes, their spout-like mouths, there they were, alive and busy, shopping, staring, talking. Children dragged at their mothers' hands. Old men with white facial hair bowed over walking sticks. Young men eyed young women. The prosperous were easily to be distinguished from the unfortunate by their newer and richer clothes, their confident and sometimes arrogant carriage. How can I describe in a few pages the distinctive character of a whole teeming and storied world, so different from my own, yet so similar? Here on my own planet, infants were being born every hour. Here, as there, they clamored for food, and very soon for companionship. They discovered what pain was, and what fear, and what loneliness and love. They grew up, molded by the harsh or kindly pressure of their fellows, to be either well-nourished, generous, sound, or mentally crippled, bitter, unwittingly vindictive. One and all, they desperately craved the bliss of true community, and very fewer here, perhaps, than in my own world, found more than the vanishing flavor of it. They howled with the pack and sounded with the pack. Starved both physically and mentally, they brawled over the quarry and tore one another to pieces, mad with hunger, physical or mental. Sometimes some of them paused and asked what it was all for, and there followed a battle of words, but no clear answer. Suddenly they were old and finished. Then, the span from birth to death being an imperceptible instant of cosmical time, they vanished. This planet, being essentially of the terrestrial type, had produced a race that was essentially human, though, so to speak, human in a different key from the terrestrial. These continents were as variegated as ours, and inhabited by a race as diversified as Homo sapiens. All the modes and facets of the spirit manifested in our history had their equivalents in the history of the other men. As with us, there had been dark ages and ages of brilliance, phases of advancement and of retreat, cultures predominantly material, and others in the main intellectual, aesthetic, or spiritual. There were Eastern races and Western races. There were empires, republics, dictatorships, yet all was different from the terrestrial. Many of the differences, of course, were superficial, but there was also an underlying, deep-lying difference which I took long to understand and will not yet describe. I must begin by speaking of the biological equipment of the other men. Their animal nature was at bottom much like ours. They responded with anger, fear, hate, tenderness, curiosity, and so on, much as we respond. In sensory equipment, they were not unlike ourselves, save that in vision they were less sensitive to color and more to form than is common with us. The violent colors of the other earth appeared to me through the eyes of its natives very subdued. In hearing also, they were rather ill-equipped. Though their auditory organs were as sensitive as ours to faint sounds, they were poor discriminators. Music, such as we know, never developed in this world. In compensation, scent and taste developed amazingly. These beings tasted not only with their mouths, but with their moist black hands and with their feet. They were thus afforded an extraordinarily rich and intimate experience on their planet. Tastes of metal and wood, of sour and sweet earths, of the many rocks, and of the innumerable shy or bold flavors of plants crushed beneath the bare, running feet, made up a whole world unknown to terrestrial man. The genitals were also well equipped with taste organs. There were several distinctive male and female patterns of chemical characteristics, each powerfully attractive to the opposite sex. These were savored faintly by contact of hands or feet with any part of the body, and with exquisite intensity in copulation. This surprising richness of gustatory experience made it very difficult for me to enter fully into the thoughts of the other men. Taste played as important a part in their imagery and conception as sight in our own. Many ideas which terrestrial man has reached by way of sight, and which even in their most abstract form still bear traces of their visual origin, the other man conceived in terms of taste. For example, our brilliant, as applied to persons or ideas, they would translate by a word whose literal meaning was tasty. For lucid, they would use a term which in imperative times was employed by hunters to signify an easily runnable taste trail. To have religious illumination was to taste the meadows of heaven. Many of our non-visual concepts also were rendered by means of taste. Complexity was many-flavored, a word applied originally to the confusion of tastes round a drinking pool frequented by many kinds of beasts. Incompatibility was derived from a word meaning the disgust which certain human types felt for one another on account of their flavors. Differences of race, which in our world are chiefly conceived in terms of bodily appearance, were for the other men almost entirely differences of taste and smell. And as the races of the other men were much less sharply localized than our own races, the strife between groups whose flavors were repugnant to one another played a great part in history. Each race tended to believe that its own flavor was characteristic of all the finer mental qualities, was indeed an absolutely reliable label of spiritual worth. In former ages, the gustatory and olfactory differences had, no doubt, been true signs of racial differences, but in modern times, and in the more developed lands, there had been great changes. Not only had the races ceased to be clearly localized, but also industrial civilization had produced a crop of genetic changes which rendered the old racial distinctions meaningless. The ancient flavors, however, though they had by now no racial significance at all, and indeed members of one family might have mutually repugnant flavors, continued to have the traditional emotional effects. In each country, some particular flavor was considered the true hallmark of the race of that country, and all other flavors were despised, if not actually condemned. In the country which I came to know best, the orthodox racial flavor was a kind of saltness inconceivable to terrestrial man. My hosts regarded themselves as the very salt of the earth. But as a matter of fact, the peasant whom I first inhabited was the only genuine pure salt man of orthodox variety whom I ever encountered. The great majority of that country's citizens attained their correct taste and smell by artificial means. Those who were at least approximately salt, with some variety of saltness, though not the ideal variety, were forever exposing the deceit of their sour, sweet, or bitter neighbors. Unfortunately, though the taste of the limbs could be fairly well disguised, no effective means had been found for changing the flavor of copulation. Consequently, newly married couples were apt to make the most shattering discoveries about one another on the wedding night. Since in the great majority of unions neither party had the orthodox flavor, both were willing to pretend to the world that all was well. But often there would turn out to be a nauseating incompatibility between the two gustatory types. The whole population was rotten with neuroses bred of these secret tragedies of marriage. Occasionally, when one party was more or less of the orthodox flavor, this genuinely salt partner would indignantly denounce the impostor. The courts, the news bulletins, and the public would then join in self-righteous protests. Some racial flavors were too obtrusive to be disguised. One, in particular, a kind of bittersweet, exposed its possessor to extravagant persecution in all but the most tolerant countries. In past times, the bittersweet race had earned a reputation of cunning and self-seeking, and had been periodically massacred by its less intelligent neighbors. But in the general biological ferment of modern times, the bittersweet flavor might crop up in any family. Woe, then, to the accursed infant and to all its relatives. Persecution was inevitable, unless indeed the family was wealthy enough to purchase from the state an honorary salting, or in the neighboring land an honorary sweetening, which removed the stigma. In the more enlightened country, the whole racial superstition was becoming suspect. There was a movement among the intelligentsia for conditioning infants to tolerate every kind of human flavor, and for discarding the deodorants and degustants, and even the boots and gloves which civilized convention imposed. Unfortunately, this movement of toleration was hampered by one of the consequences of industrialism. In the congested and unhealthy industrial centers, a new gustatory and olfactory type had appeared, apparently as a biological mutation. In a couple of generations, this sour, astringent, and indisguisable flavor dominated in all the most disreputable working-class quarters. To the fastidious palates of the well-to-do, it was overwhelmingly nauseating and terrifying. In fact, it became for them an unconscious symbol, tapping all the secret guilt and fear and hate which the oppressors felt for the oppressed. In this world, as in our own, nearly all the chief means of production, nearly all the land, mines, factories, railways, ships, were controlled for private profit by a small minority of the population. These privileged individuals were able to force the masses to work for them on pain of starvation. The tragic farce inherent in such a system was already approaching. The owners directed the energy of the workers increasingly towards the production of more means of production rather than to the fulfillment of the needs of individual life. For machinery might bring profit to the owners, bread would not. With the increasing competition of machine with machine, profits declined, and therefore wages, and therefore effective demand for goods. Marketless products were destroyed, though bellies were unfed and backs unclad. Unemployment, disorder, and stern repression increased as the economic system disintegrated. A familiar story. As conditions deteriorated and the movements of charity and state charity became less and less able to cope with the increasing mass of unemployment and destitution, the new pariah race became more and more psychologically useful to the hate needs of the scared, but still powerful, prosperous. The theory was spread that these wretched beings were the result of secret systemic race pollution by riffraff immigrants, and that they deserved no consideration whatever. They were therefore allowed only the basest forms of employment and the harshest conditions of work. When unemployment had become a serious social problem, practically the whole pariah stock was workless and destitute. It was, of course, easily believed that unemployment, far from being due to the decline of capitalism, was due to the worthlessness of the pariahs. At the time of my visit, the working class had become tainted through and through by the pariah stock, and there was a vigorous movement afoot amongst the wealthy and the official classes to institute slavery for pariahs and half-pariahs, so that these might be openly treated as the cattle, which, in fact, they were. In view of the danger of continued race pollution, some politicians urged wholesale slaughter of the pariahs, or, at the least, universal sterilization. Others pointed out that, as a supply of cheap labor was necessary to society, it would be wiser merely to keep their numbers down by working them to an early death in occupations which those of pure race would never accept. This, at any rate, should be done in times of prosperity, but in times of decline, the excess population could be allowed to starve, or might be used up in the physiological laboratories. The persons who first dared to suggest this policy were scourged by the whips of generous popular indignation, but their policy was in fact adopted, not explicitly, but by tacit consent, and in the absence of any more constructive plan. The first time that I was taken through the poorest quarter of the city, I was surprised to see that, though there were large areas of slum property far more squalid than anything in England, there were also many great clean blocks of tenements worthy of Vienna. These were surrounded by gardens, which were crowded with wretched tents and shanties. The grass was worn away, the bushes damaged, the flowers trampled. Everywhere men, women, and children, all filthy and ragged, were idling. I learned that these noble buildings had been erected before the world economic crisis, familiar phrase, by a millionaire who had made his money in trading in opium-like drug. He presented the buildings to the city council and was gathered to heaven by way of the peerage. The more deserving and the less unsavory poor were duly housed, but care was taken to fix the rent high enough to exclude the pariah race. Then came the crisis. One by one, the tenants failed to pay their rent and were ejected. Within a year, the buildings were almost empty. There followed a very curious sequence of events, and one which, as I was to discover, was characteristic of this strange world. Respectable public opinion, though vindictive toward the unemployed, was passionately tender toward the sick. In falling ill, a man acquired a special sanctity and exercised a claim over all healthy persons. Thus, no sooner did any of the wretched campers succumb to a serious disease than he was carried off to be cared for by all the resources of medical science. The desperate paupers soon discovered how things stood, and did all in their power to fall sick. So successful were they that the hospitals were soon filled. The empty tenements were therefore hastily fitted out to receive the increasing flood of patients. Observing these and other farcical events, I was reminded of my own race. But though the other men were in many ways so like us, I suspected increasingly that some factor still hidden from me doomed them to a frustration which my own nobler species need never fear. Psychological mechanisms, which in our case was tempered with common sense or moral sense, stood out in this world in flagrant excess. Yet, it was not true that other men was less intelligent or less moral than man of my own species. In abstract thought and practical invention, he was at least our equal. Many of his most recent advances in physics and astronomy had passed beyond our present attainment. I noticed, however, that psychology was even more chaotic than with us, and that social thought was strangely perverted. In radio and television, for instance, the other men were technically not far ahead of us, but the use to which they put their astounding inventions was disastrous. In civilized countries, everyone but the pariahs carried a pocket receiving set. As the other men had no music, this may seem odd, but since they lacked newspapers, radio was the only means by which the man in the street could learn the lottery and sporting results which were his staple mental diet. The place of music, moreover, was taken by taste and smell themes, which were translated into patterns of ethereal undulation, transmitted by all the great national stations, and restored to their original form in the pocket receivers and taste batteries of the population. These instruments afforded intricate stimuli to the taste organs and scent organs of the hand. Such was the power of this kind of entertainment that both men and women were nearly always seen with one hand in a pocket. A special wavelength had been allotted to the soothing of infants. A sexual receiving set had been put upon the market, and programs were broadcast for it in many countries, but not in all. This extraordinary invention was a combination of radio touch, taste, odor, and sound. It worked not through the sense organs, but by direct stimulation of the appropriate brain centers. The recipient wore a special constructed skull cap, which transmitted to him from a remote studio the embraces of some delectable and responsive woman, as they were then actually being experienced by a male love broadcaster, or as electromagnetically recorded on a steel tape on some earlier occasion. Controversies had arisen about the morality of sexual broadcasting. Some countries permitted programs for males, but not for females, wishing to preserve the innocence of the purer sex. Elsewhere, the clerics had succeeded in crushing the whole project on the score that radio sex, even for men alone, would be a diabolical substitute for a certain much desired and jealously guarded religious experience called the Immaculate Union, of which I shall tell in the sequel. Well did the priests know that their power depended largely on their ability to induce this luscious ecstasy in their flock by means of ritual and other psychological techniques. Militarists also were strongly opposed to the new invention, for in the cheap and efficient production of illusory sexual embraces, they saw a danger even more serious than contraception. The supply of cannon fodder would decline. Since in all the more respectable countries broadcasting had been put under the control of retired soldiers or good churchmen, the new device was at first adopted only in the more commercial and the more disreputable states. From their broadcasting stations, the embraces of popular radio love stars and even the impecunious aristocrats were broadcast along with advertisements of patent medicines, taste-proof gloves, lottery results, savors, and degustants. The principle of radio brain stimulation was soon developed much further. Programmers of all the most luscious or piquant experiences were broadcast in all countries and could be picked up by simple receivers that were within the means of all save the pariahs. Thus, even the laborers and the factory hand could have the pleasures of a banquet without expense and consequent repletion, the delights of proficient dancing without the trouble of learning the art, the thrills of motor racing without danger. In an ice-bound northern home, he could bask on tropical beaches, and in the tropics indulge in winter sports. Governments soon discovered that the new invention gave them a cheap and effective kind of power over their subjects. Slum conditions could be tolerated if there was an unfailing supply of illusory luxury. Reforms distasteful to the authorities could be shelved if they could be represented as inimical to the national radio system. Strikes and riots could often be broken by the mere threat to close down the broadcasting studios, or alternatively, by flooding the ether at a critical moment with some saccharine novelty. The fact that the political left wing opposed the further development of radio amusements made governments and the propertied classes the more ready to accept it. The communists, for the dialectic of history on this curiously Earth-like planet, had produced a party deserving that name, strongly condemned the scheme. In their view, it was pure capitalist dope, calculated to prevent the otherwise inevitable dictatorship of the proletariat. The increasing opposition of the communists made it impossible to buy off the opposition of their natural enemies, the priests and soldiers. It was arranged that religious services should in future occupy a larger proportion of broadcasting time, and that a tithe of all licensing fees should be allocated to the churches. The offer to broadcast the Immaculate Union, however, was rejected by the clerics. As an additional concession, it was agreed that all married members of the staffs of broadcasting authorities must, on pain of dismissal, prove that they had never spent a night away from their wives or husbands. It was also agreed to weed out all those BA employees who were suspected of sympathy with such disreputable ideals as pacifism and freedom of expression. The soldiers were further appeased by a state subsidy for maternity, attacks on bachelors, and regular broadcasting of military propaganda. During my last years on the other Earth, a system was invented by which a man could retire to bed for life and spend all his time receiving radio programs. His nourishment and all his bodily functions were attended to by doctors and nurses attached to the Broadcasting Authority. In place of exercise, he received periodic massage. Participation in the scheme was, at first, an expensive luxury, but its inventors hoped to make it at no distant date available to all. It was even expected that in time medical and menial attendance would cease to be necessary. A vast system of automatic food production and distribution of liquid pabulum by means of pipes leading to the mouths of the recumbent subjects would be complemented by an intricate sewage system. Electric massage could be applied at will by pressing a button. Medical supervision would be displaced by an automatic endocrine compensation system. This would enable the condition of the patient's blood to regulate itself automatically by tapping from the communal drug pipes whatever chemicals were needed for correct physiological balance. Even in the case of broadcasting itself, the human element would no longer be needed, for all possible pleasant experiences would have been already recorded from the most exquisite living examples. These would be continuously broadcast in a great number of alternative programs. A few technicians and organizers might still be needed to superintend the system, but, properly distributed, their work would entail for each member of the World Broadcasting Authority's staff no more than a few hours of interesting activity each week. Children, if future generations were required, would be produced ectogenetically. The World Director of Broadcasting would be requested to submit psychological and physiological specifications of the ideal listening breed. Infants produced in accordance with this pattern would then be educated by special radio programs to prepare them for adult radio life. They would never leave their cots, save to pass by stages at the full-sized beds of maturity. At the latter end of life, if medical science did not succeed in circumventing senility and death, the individual would at least be able to secure a painless end by pressing an appropriate button. Enthusiasm for this astounding project spread rapidly in all civilized countries, but certain forces of reaction were bitterly opposed to it. The old-fashioned religious people and the militant nationalists both affirmed that it was man's glory to be active. The religious held that only in self-discipline, mortification of the flesh, and constant prayer could the soul be fitted for eternal life. The nationalists of each country declared that their own people had been given a sacred trust to rule the baser kinds, and that in any case only the marital virtues could ensure the spirit's admittance to Valhalla. Many of the great economic masters, though they had originally favored radio bliss in moderation as an opiate for the discontented workers, now turned against it. Their craving was for power, and for power they needed slaves whose labor they could command for their great industrial ventures. They therefore devised an instrument which was at once an opiate and a spur. By every method of propaganda they sought to rouse the passions of nationalism and racial hatred. They created, in fact, the other fascism, complete with lies, with mystical cult of race and state, with scorn of reason, with praise of brutal mastery, with appeal at once to the vilest and to the generous motives of the deluded young. Opposed to all these critics of radio bliss, and equally opposed to radio bliss itself, there was in each country a small and bewildered party which asserted that the true goal of human activity was the creation of a worldwide community of awakened and intelligently creative persons, related by mutual insight and respect, and by the common task of fulfilling the potentiality of the human spirit on earth. Much of their doctrine was a restatement of the teachings of religious seers of a time long past, but it had also been deeply influenced by contemporary science. This party, however, was misunderstood by the scientists, cursed by the clerics, ridiculed by the militarists, and ignored by the advocates of radio bliss. Now, at this time, economic confusion had been driving the great commercial empires of the other earth into more and more desperate competition for markets. These economic rivalries had combined with ancient tribal passions of fear and hate and pride to bring about an interminable series of war scares, each of which threatened universal Armageddon. In this situation, the radio enthusiasts pointed out that, if their policy were accepted, war would never occur, and on the other hand that, if a world war broke out, their policy would be indefinitely postponed. They contrived a worldwide peace movement, and such was the passion for radio bliss that the demand for peace swept all countries. An international broadcasting authority was at last founded to propagate the radio gospel, compose the differences between the empires, and eventually to take over the sovereignty of the world. Sounds like a negative review of a planet. Yes, would not recommend to stay around or living. Yes. Oh, wait. Huh. Oh, Carno. It's almost as if this other planet is like this planet. What? Meanwhile, the earnestly religious and the sincere militarists, rightly dismayed at the baseness of the motives behind the new internationalism, but in their own manner equally wrong-headed, determined to save the other men in spite of themselves by goading the peoples into war. All the forces of propaganda and financial corruption were heroically wielded to foment the passions of nationalism. Even so, the greed for radio bliss was by now so general and so passionate that the war party would never have succeeded had it not been for the wealth of the great armorers and their experience in fomenting strife. No, their noses are above their eyes. Totally different. It's totally different. You're right. You're right. Trouble was successfully created between one of the older commercial empires and a certain state which had only recently adopted mechanical civilization, but was already a great power, and a power in desperate needs of markets. Radio, which formerly had been the main force making the cosmopolitanism, became suddenly in each country the main stimulus to nationalism. Morning, noon, and night, every civilized people was assured that enemies, whose flavor was of course subhuman and foul, were plotting its destruction. Armament scares, spy stories, accounts of the barbarous and sadistic behavior of neighboring peoples, created in every country such uncritical suspicion and hate that war became inevitable. A dispute arose over the control of a frontier province during those critical days. Valtu, as they say, like the Welsh. And I happened to be in a large provincial town. I shall never forget how the populace plunged into almost maniacal hate. All thought of human brotherhood and even of personal safety was swept away by a savage bloodlust. Panic-stricken governments began projecting long-range rocket bombs at their dangerous neighbors. Within a few weeks, several of the capitals of the other Earth had been destroyed from the air. Each people now began straining every nerve to do more hurt than it received. Of the horrors of this war, of the destruction of city after city, of the panic-stricken, starving hosts that swarmed into the open country, looting and killing, of the starvation and disease, of the disintegration of the social services, of the emergence of ruthless military dictatorships, of the steady or catastrophic decay of culture, and of all decency and gentleness in personal relations. Of this, there is no need to speak in detail. Instead, I shall try to account for the finality of the disaster which overtook the other men. My own humankind, in similar circumstances, would never, surely, have allowed itself to be so completely overwhelmed. No doubt, we ourselves are faced with the possibility of a scarcely less destructive war, but whatever the agony that awaits us, we shall almost certainly recover. Foolish we may be, but we always manage to avoid falling into the abyss of downright madness. At the last moment, sanity falteringly reasserts itself. Not so with the other men. Part 3 of chapter 3. I'm gonna take a sip. We still have 34 minutes left in this chapter. Totally not talking about regular Earth. This is other Earth. What great descriptions into create a whole other world that is unlike Earth and have that like outside perspective is pretty cool. I enjoy it. I'm really enjoying it. And I really like how I like the little differences between like the other men and like Earth terrestrial men, and that like their sense of taste is super, super heightened. I think that's cool. How they feed their babies is disturbing, but that's fine. Definitely not like Earth. Take your fine English tea sip they don't have there. Exactly. Totally not like Earth. Alright. Part 3 of chapter 3. Prospects of the race. The longer I stayed on the other Earth, the more I suspected that there must be some important underlying difference between this human race and my own. In some sense, the difference was obviously one of balance. Homo sapiens was, on the whole, better integrated, more gifted with common sense, less apt to fall into extravagance through mental dissociation. Perhaps the most striking example of the extravagance of the other men was the part played by religion in their more advanced societies. Religion was a much greater power than on my own planet, and the religious teachings of the prophets of old were able to kindle even my alien and sluggish heart with fervor. Yet religion, as it occurred around me in contemporary society, was far from edifying. I must begin by explaining that in the development of religion on the other Earth, gustatory sensation had played a very great part. Tribal gods had, of course, been endowed with the taste characters, most moving to the tribe's own members. Later, when monotheisms arose, descriptions of God's power, his wisdom, his judgment, or his justice, his benevolence, were accompanied by descriptions of his taste. In mystical literature, God was often likened to an ancient and mellow wine, and some reports of religious experience suggested that this gustatory ecstasy was in many ways akin to the reverent zest of our own wine tasters, savoring some rare vintage. Unfortunately, owing to the diversity of gustatory human types, there had seldom been any widespread agreement as to the taste of God. Religious wars had been waged to decide whether he was in the main sweet or salt, or whether his preponderant flavor was one of the many gustatory characters which my own race cannot conceive. Some teachers insisted that only the feet could taste him, others only the hands or the mouth, others that he could be experienced only in the subtle complex of gustatory flavors known as the Immaculate Union, which was a sensual and mainly sexual ecstasy induced by contemplation of intercourse with the deity. Other teachers declared that, though God was indeed tasty, it was not through any bodily instrument, but to the naked spirit that his essence was revealed, and that his was a flavor more subtle and delicious than the flavor of the beloved, since it included all that was most fragrant and spiritual in man, and infinitely more. Definitely sounds complicated, yes. You got that? Intercourse with the deity. Got it. Some went so far as to declare that God should be thought of not as a person at all, but as actually being this flavor. Voltu used to say, either God is the universe, or he is the flavor of creativity pervading all things. Some 10 or 15 centuries earlier, when religion, so far as I could tell, was most vital, there were no churches or priesthoods, but every man's life was dominated by religious ideas to an extent which to me was almost incredible. Later, churches and priesthoods had returned to play an important part in preserving what was now evidently a declining religious consciousness. Still later, a few centuries before the Industrial Revolution, institutional religion had gained such a hold on the most civilized peoples that 3/4 of their total income was spent on the upkeep of religious institutions. The working class, indeed, who slaved for the owners in return for a mere pittance, gave much of their miserable earnings to the priests, and lived in more abject squalor than need have been. Science and industry had brought one of those sudden and extreme revolutions of thought which were so characteristic of the other men. Nearly all the churches were destroyed or turned into temporary factories or industrial museums. Atheism, lately persecuted, became fashionable. All the best minds turned agnostic. More recently, however, apparently in horror at the effects of a materialistic culture which was far more cynical and blatant than our own, the most industrialized peoples began to turn once more to religion. A spiritistic foundation was provided for natural science. The old churches were re-sanctified, and so many new religious edifices were built that they were soon as plentiful as cinema houses with us. Indeed, the new churches gradually absorbed the cinema and provided non-stop picture shows in which sensual orgies, and ecclesiastical propaganda were skillfully blended. At the time of my visit, the churches had regained all their lost power. Radio had indeed at one time competed with them, but was successfully absorbed. They still refused to broadcast the Immaculate Union, which gained fresh prestige from the popular belief that it was too spiritual to be transmitted on the ether. The more advanced clerics, however, had agreed that if ever the universal system of radio bliss was established, this difficulty might be overcome. Communism, meanwhile, still maintained its irreligious convention, but in the two great communist countries, the officially organized irreligion was becoming a religion in all but name. It had its institutions, its priesthood, its ritual, its morality, its system of absolution, its metaphysical doctrines, which, though devoutly materialistic, were none the less superstitious, and the flavor of deity had been displaced by the flavor of proletariat. Only have I been to orgies. Interesting religion. Take notes. Religion, then, was a very real force in the life of all these peoples. But there was something puzzling about their devoutness. In a sense, it was sincere and even beneficial. For in very small personal temptations and very obvious and stereotyped moral choices, the other men were far more conscientious than my own kind. But I discovered that the typical modern other man was conscientious only in conventional situations, and that in genuine moral sensibility he was strangely lacking. Thus, though practical generosity and superficial comradeship were more usual than with us, the most diabolical mental persecution was penetrated with a clear conscience. The more sensitive had always to be on their guard. The deeper kinds of intimacy and mutual reliance were precarious and rare. In this passionately social world, loneliness dogged the spirit. People were constantly getting together, but they never really got there. Everyone was terrified of being alone with himself, yet in company, in spite of the universal assumption of comradeship, these strange beings remained as remote from one another as the stars. For everyone searched his neighbor's eyes for the image of himself and never saw anything else. Or if he did, he was outraged and terrified. Another perplexing fact about the religious life of the other man at the time of my visit was this. Though all were devout, and blasphemy was regarded with honor, the general attitude to the deity was one of blasphemous commercialism. Men assumed that the flavor of deity could be bought for all eternity with money or with ritual. Further, the God whom they worshipped with the superb and heart-searching language of an earlier age was now conceived either as a just but jealous employer, or as an indulgent parent, or else as sheer physical energy. The crowning vulgarity was the conviction that in no earlier age had religion been so widespread and so enlightened. It was almost universally agreed that the profound teachings of the prophetic era were only now being understood in the sense in which they had originally been intended by the prophets themselves. Contemporary writers and broadcasters claimed to be reinterpreting the scriptures to suit the enlightened religious needs of an age which called itself the age of scientific religion. Now, behind all the complacency which characterized the civilization of the other men before the outbreak of the war, I had often detected a vague restlessness and anxiety. Of course, for the most part, people went about their affairs with the same absorbed and self-satisfied interest as on my own planet. They were far too busy making a living, marrying, rearing children, rearing families, trying to get the better of one another, to spare time for conscious doubt about the aim of life. Yet they had often the air of one who has forgotten some very important thing and is racking his brains to recover it, or of an aging preacher who uses the old stirring phrases without clear apprehension of their significance. Increasingly, I suspected that this race, in spite of all its triumphs, was now living on the great ideas of its past, mouthing concepts that it no longer had the sensibility to understand, paying verbal homage to ideals which it could no longer sincerely will, and behaving within a system of institutions many of which could only be worked successfully by minds of a slightly finer temper. These institutions, I suspected, must have been created by a race endowed not only with much greater intelligence, but with a much stronger and more comprehensive capacity for community than was now possible on the other earth. They seemed to be based on the assumption that men were on the whole kindly, reasonable, and self-disciplined. I had often questioned Vivaltu on this subject, but he had always turned my question aside. It will be remembered that, though I had access to all his thoughts so long as he did not positively wish to withhold them, he could always, if he made a special effort, think privately. I had long suspected that he was keeping something from me, when at last he told me the strange and tragic facts. It was a few days after the bombardment of the metropolis of his country. Through Vivaltu's eyes and the goggles of his gas mask, I saw the results of that bombardment. We had missed the horror itself, but had attempted to return to the city to play some part in the rescue work. Little could be done. So great was the heat still radiated from the city's incandescent heart that we could not penetrate beyond the first suburb. Even there, the streets were obliterated, choked with fallen buildings, human bodies crushed and charred, projected here and there from masses of tumbled masonry. Most of the population was hidden under the ruins. In the open spaces many lay gassed. Salvage parties impotently wandered. Between the smoke clouds, the other sun occasionally appeared, and even a daytime star. After clambering among the ruins for some time, seeking vainly to give help, Vivaltu sat down. The devastation round about us seemed to loosen his tongue, if I may use such a phrase to express a sudden frankness in his thinking toward myself. I had said something to the effect that a future age would look back on all this madness and destruction with amazement. He sighed through his gas mask and said, "My unhappy race has probably now doomed itself irrevocably." I expostulated. For though ours was about the 40th city to be destroyed, there would surely be some day be a recovery, and the race would at last pass through this crisis and go forward from strength to strength. Vivaltu then told me of the strange matters which, he said, he had often intended to tell me, but somehow he had always shunned doing so. Though many scientists and students of the contemporary world society had now some vague suspicion of the truth, it was clearly known only to himself and a few others. The species, he said, was apparently subject to strange and long drawn-out fluctuations of nature, fluctuations which lasted for some 20,000 years. All races and all climates seemed to manifest this vast rhythm of the spirit and to suffer it simultaneously. Its cause was unknown, though it seemed to be due to an influence affecting the whole planet at once. Perhaps it actually radiated from a single starting point, but spread rapidly into all lands. Very recently, an advanced scientist had suggested that it might be due to variations in the intensity of cosmic rays. Geological evidence had established that such a fluctuation of cosmical radiation did occur, caused perhaps by variations in a neighboring cluster of young stars. It was still doubtful whether the psychological rhythm and the astronomical rhythm coincided, but many facts pointed to the conclusion that when the rays were more violent, the human spirit declined. Valtu was not convinced by this theory. On the whole, he inclined to the opinion that the rhythmical waxing and waning of human mentality was due to causes nearer home. Whatever the true explanation, it was almost certain that a high degree of civilization had been attained many times in the past, and that some potent influence had over and over again damped down the mental vigor of the human race. In the troughs of these vast waves, other man sank to a state of mental and spiritual dullness more abject than anything which my own race had ever known since it awoke from the subhuman. But at the wave's crest, man's intellectual power, moral integrity, and spiritual insight seem to have risen to a pitch that we should regard as superhuman. Again and again, the race would emerge from savagery and pass through barbarian culture into a phase of worldwide brilliance and sensibility. Whole populations would conceive simultaneously in ever-increasing capacity for generosity, self-knowledge, self-discipline, for dispassionate and penetrating thought and uncontaminated religious feeling. Consequently, within a few centuries, the whole world would blossom with free and happy societies. Average human beings would attain an unprecedented clarity of mind, and by massed action do away with all grave social injustices and private cruelties. Subsequent generations, inherently sound and blessed with a favorable environment, would create a worldwide utopia of awakened beings. Presently, a general loosening of fiber would set in. The Golden Age would be followed by a Silver Age. Living on the achievements of the past, the leader of thought would lose themselves in a jungle of subtlety, or fall exhausted into mere slovenliness. At the same time, moral sensibility would decline. Men would become, on the whole, less sincere, less self-searching, less sensitive to the needs of others, in fact, less capable of community. Social machinery, which had worked well so long as citizens attained a certain level of humanity, would be dislocated by injustice and corruption. Tyrants and tyrannical oligarchies would set about destroying liberty. Hate-mad, submerged classes would give them good excuse. Little by little, though the material benefits of civilization might smolder on for centuries, the flame of the spirit would die down into a mere flicker in a few isolated individuals. Then would come sheer barbarism, followed by the trough of almost some subhuman savagery. On the whole, there seemed to have been a higher achievement on the more recent crests of the wave than on those of the geological past. So at least some anthropologists persuaded themselves. It was confidently believed that the present apex of civilization was the most brilliant of all, that its best was yet to come, and that by means of its unique scientific knowledge it would discover how to preserve the mentality of the race from a recurrence of deterioration. The present condition of the species was certainly exceptional. In no earlier recorded cycle had science and mechanization advanced to such lengths. So far as could be inferred from the fragmentary relics of the previous cycle, mechanical invention had never passed beyond the crude machinery known in our mid-19th century. The still earlier cycles, it was believed, stagnated at even earlier stages in their industrial revolutions. Now, though it was generally assumed in intellectual circles that the best was yet to be, Vivaltu and his friends were convinced that the crest of the wave had already occurred many centuries ago. To most men, of course, the decade before the war had seemed better and more civilized than any earlier age. In their view, civilization and mechanization were almost identical, and never before had there been such a triumph of mechanization. The benefits of a scientific civilization were obvious. For the fortunate class, there was more comfort, better health, increased stature, a prolongation of youth, and a system of technical knowledge so vast and intricate that no man could know more than its outline or some tiny corner of its detail. Moreover, increased communications had brought all the peoples into contact. Local idiosyncrasies were fading out before the radio, the cinema, and the gramophone. In comparison with these hopeful signs, it was easily overlooked that the human constitution, though strengthened by improved conditions, was intrinsically less stable than formerly. Certain disintegrative diseases were slowly but surely increasing. In particular, diseases of the nervous system were becoming more common and more pernicious. Cynics used to say that the mental hospitals would soon outnumber even the churches, but the cynics were only jesters. It was almost universally agreed that, in spite of wars and economic troubles and social upheavals, all was now well, and the future would be better. In truth, said Vivaltu. The truth, said Vivaltu, was almost certainly otherwise. There was, as I had suspected, unmistakable evidence that the average of intelligence and of moral integrity throughout the world had declined, and they would probably continue to do so. Already the race was living on its past. All the great seminal ideas of the modern world had been conceived centuries ago. Since then, world-changing applications of these ideas had indeed been made, but none of these sensational inventions had depended on the extreme kind of penetrating and comprehensive intuition which had changed the whole course of thoughts in an earlier age. Recently there had been, Vivaltu admitted, a spate of revolutionary scientific discoveries and theories, but not one of them, he said, contained any real novel principle. They were all recombinations of familiar principles. Scientific method, invented some centuries ago, was so fertile a technique that it might well continue to yield rich fruit for centuries to come, even in the hands of workers incapable of any high degree of originality. But it was not in the field of science so much as in moral and practical activity that the deterioration of mental caliber was most evident. I myself, with Vivaltu's aid, had learnt to appreciate to some extent the literature of that amazing period, many centuries earlier, when every country seemed to blossom with art, philosophy, and religion, when people after people had changed its whole social and political order so as to secure a measure of freedom and prosperity to all men, when state after state had courageously disarmed, risking destruction but reaping peace and prosperity, when police forces were disbanded, prisons turned into libraries or colleges, when weapons and even locks and keys came to be known only as museum pieces, when the four great established priesthoods of the world had exposed their own mysteries, given their wealth to the poor, and led the triumphant campaign for community, or had taken to agriculture, handicrafts, teaching, as befitted humble supporters of the new priestless, faithless, godless religion of worldwide community and inarticulate worship. After some 500 years, locks and keys, weapons and doctrines began to return. The Golden Age left behind it only a lovely and incredible tradition, and a set of principles which, though now sadly misconceived, were still the best influences in a distraught world. Those scientists who attributed mental deterioration to the increase of cosmic rays affirmed that if the race had discovered science many centuries ago, when it had still before it the period of greatest vitality, all would have been well. It would soon have mastered the social problems of industrial civilization entails. It would have created not merely a medieval, but a highly mechanized utopia. It would almost certainly have discovered how to cope with the excess of cosmic rays and prevent deterioration. But science had come too late. Bvaltu, on the other hand, suspected that deterioration was due to some factor in human nature itself. He was inclined to believe that it was a consequence of civilization, that in changing the whole environment of the human species, seemingly for the better, science had unwittingly brought about a state of affairs hostile to spiritual vigor. He did not pretend to know whether the disaster was caused by the increase of artificial food, or the increased nervous strain of modern conditions, or interference with natural selection, or the softer upbringing of children, or to some other cause. Perhaps it should be attributed to none of these comparatively recent influences, for evidence did not suggest that deterioration had set in at the very beginning of the scientific age, if not even earlier. It might be that some mysterious factor in the conditions of the Golden Age itself had started the rot. It might even be, he suggested, that genuine community generated its own poison, that the young human being, brought up in a perfected society, in a veritable city of God on earth, must inevitably revolt toward moral and intellectual laziness, toward romantic individualism and sheer devilment, and that, once this disposition had taken root, science and a mechanized civilization had augmented the spiritual decay. Shortly before I left the other Earth, a geologist discovered a fossil diagram of a very complicated radio set. It appeared to be a lithographic plate which had been made some 10 million years earlier. The highly developed society which produced it had left no other trace. This find was a shock to the intelligent world, but the comforting view was spread abroad that some non-human and less hardy species had long ago attained a brief flicker of civilization. It was agreed that man, once he had reached such a height of culture, would never have fallen from it. In Bvaltu's view, man had climbed approximately to the same height time after time, only to be undone by some hidden consequence of his own achievement. When Bvaltu propounded this theory among the ruins of his native city, I suggested that sometime, if not this time, man would successfully pass this critical point in his career. Bvaltu then spoke of another matter which seemed to indicate that we were witnessing the final act of this long drawn out and repetitive drama. It was known to the scientists that, owing to the weak gravitational hold of their world, the atmosphere, already scant, was steadily decreasing. Sooner or later, humanity would have to face the problem of stopping this constant leakage of precious oxygen. Hitherto, life had successfully adapted itself to the progressive rarefaction of atmosphere, but the human physique had already reached the limit of adaptability in this respect. If the loss were not soon checked, the race would inevitably decline. The only hope was that some means to deal with the atmospheric problem would be discovered before the onset of the next age of barbarism. There had only been a slight possibility that this would be achieved. this slender hope the war had destroyed by setting the clock of scientific research back for a century just at the time when human nature itself was deteriorating and might never again be able to tackle so difficult a problem. The thought of the disaster which almost certainly lay in wait for the other men threw me into a horror of doubt about the universe in which such a thing could happen. That a whole world of intelligent beings could be destroyed was not an unfamiliar idea to me, but there is a great difference between an abstract possibility and a concrete, inescapable danger. On my native planet, whenever I had been dismayed by the suffering and the futility of individuals, I had taken comfort in the thought that at least the massed effect of our own blind striving must be the slow but glorious awakening of the human spirit. This hope, this certainty, had been the one sure consolation, but now I saw that there was no guarantee of any such triumph. It seemed that the universe, or the maker of the universe, must be indifferent to the fate of the worlds. That there should be endless struggle and suffering and waste must, of course, be accepted and gladly, for these were the very soil in which the spirit grew. But that all struggle should be finally, absolutely vain, that a whole world of sensitive spirits should fail and die, must be sheer evil. In my honor, it seemed to me that hate must be the star maker. Atmospheric oxygen problem? Huh. But that's on the other Earth, so it's fine. We don't have to worry about that. Oh, yeah. Not so, to Bavalzu. Even if the power destroys us, he said, who are we to condemn them? As well might a fleeting word judge the speaker that forms it. Perhaps they use us for their own high ends, use our strength and our weaknesses, our joy and our pain in some theme inconceivable to us and excellent. But I protested. What theme could justify such waste, such futility? And how can we help judging? And how otherwise can we judge than by the light of our own hearts, by which we judge ourselves? It would be base to praise the star maker, knowing that he was too insensitive to care about the fate of our worlds. Baltu was silent in his mind for a moment. Then he looked up, searching among the smoke clouds for a daytime star. And then he said to me in his mind, if he saved all the worlds, but tormented just one man, would you forgive him? Or if he was a little harsh only to one stupid child? What has our pain to do with it, or our failure? Star maker, it is a good word, though we can have no notion of its meaning. O star maker, even if you destroy me, I must praise you. Even if you torture my dearest, even if you torture and waste all our lovely worlds, the little figments of your imagination, yet I must praise you, for if you do so, it must be right. In me it would be wrong, but in you it must be right. He looked down once more upon the ruined city, then continued, and if, after all, there is no star maker, if the great company of galaxies leapt into being of their own accord, and even if this little nasty world of ours is the only habitation of the spirit anywhere among the stars, and this world doomed, even so, I must praise. But if there is no star maker, what can it be that I praise? I do not know. I will call it only the sharp tang and savor of existence, but to call it this is to say little. End of chapter 3. That was a massive chapter, over an hour long. Sounds dangerously masochistic. Yes. Oh, don't worry. this is all on Other Earth and other men, not on Earth. I am really enjoying this. I'm really enjoying this. I'm having a grand old time. And like I said at the beginning, um, and like it was in the preface of this book, Star Maker, and in the preface of another science fiction book that I'm reading, science fiction is not about what could be or what, will happen. It's about what's happening now and the commentary of what's happening now. And this book was written in 1937. So keeping that in mind and seeing what is still relevant today or isn't relevant today is really interesting. It's just super, super interesting. But that's going to be it for today. We will be back very, very soon, continuing right where we left off. So we just finished chapter 3. We are 23% of the book, but there are notes at the end, so that's a little misleading. But it's a good time. I'm enjoying it. Thank you, Twilight Stone, for being here. But yeah, I hope you all have a great night. I hope I see you soon. If not, I hope to see you even sooner. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you, and I 1000% appreciate your support. Have a good one, everyone.